Everyone kind of in frame? Okay, we're live.
And we're live. Hello and welcome to our second TOK Talk panel. We will be addressing the second prescribed title this year, given by the IB. The title is, How Can We Reconcile the Opposing Demands for Specialization and Generalization in the Production of Knowledge? Discussed with reference to mathematics and one other area of knowledge. For those of you back at home who do not know the area of knowledges, we have history, natural science, human science, arts, and mathematics. As mathematics is one of the already selected ones, we will not be using it as one of the additional options. Just so that you know, it is Pride Week here, and we are wearing, well, I am wearing sunglasses with the support of everyone near me. You know, they want to make sure that their eyes and their attention is directed towards the other panelists as they are not moderating. But wearing sunglasses to support the idea of reflecting homophobia, supporting our queer students and queer students across the globe. So I have a few sort of central ideas that we got to get on the board before we start going here. As my role as a moderator is generally to just make sure that things progress smoothly. I will not interject my ideas too much into this, but to set us up, I want us to pay attention to several words here. If you've got my documents, you've seen I pull this out. The central word here for me is the idea of reconciling. Now, there are two definitions here that we can use. Reconcile means, on one hand, to restore friendly relationships between. You can imagine reconciling with an old high school friend who stole your prom date, and you forgive them for that. Yes? Yeah, we forgive them. Or, number two, it is to make one account consistent with another account. Both of these meanings, I think, are interesting and useful when it comes to the idea of reconciling between specialization and generalization. Just so we understand also specialization and generalization, the terms in this case apply to the idea in particular of the production of knowledge. This is a really crucial, I think, distinction we should make. One who is specializing, for example, I could specialize in identifying certain species of fungi in my walks around campus. That is one type of specialization. That is not really exactly what we're talking about here unless it involves the production of knowledge. So we are focusing on knowledge production.
Oh, fungi. Are you talking about mushrooms? I think you're talking about Mr. Pavone.
Yes.
I was confused.
Well, sometimes I see him wandering through the woods.
Yeah.
I identify
And
him.
you'll identify me. That's
Also a fun guy.
A fun guy as
Excuse
well.
me, guys.
Yeah, and the idea basically being here that we make sure that we understand that we're not just talking about specialization and generalization in terms of learning things, but in diving into the work of producing knowledge. Specialization being a focus on a very narrow space, as narrow as you can sort of imagine now in academic circles in universities. Generalization, again, being the notion of having some understanding, potentially shallower, likely shallower, within a diversity of fields. That does not mean necessarily between AOKs. We can imagine a math generalist or a history generalist, but it does mean that you are not just focused on one niche space. For example, garments worn by monks in northern England between 1800 and 1850 being an example of extreme specialization. With that being said, I don't think I have much more to contribute now at the beginning here. I hope my questions were relevant and useful. Feel free to consult the document. That being said, let's see if anyone wants to start us off with the idea of what specialization looks like in mathematics today. I think we have two people here who might be able to start a conversation. So the question is, what does specialization look like in math today?
Well, I would guess that specialization in mathematics is not too much different than specialization in any other field, in that a mathematician, say at a university, is heavily focused on one field of math as opposed to some of the other aspects of math. Sure, up until, let's say, a few hundred years ago, you could understand all math. Like if you were a very educated person, you could understand everything that everyone else knew in the field of mathematics. And is that the case now? Probably not. There probably some areas of mathematics that are only studied by a very few people, and if they tried to have a conversation with someone outside of their little community, it might be rather difficult, and they'd have to do quite a bit of explaining as to what exactly they are doing. And I can imagine that the same would occur in the physical sciences and physics, in chemistry as well, that there are scientists who really focus on one very niche area, and they don't look too far beyond that, but they gain a very deep understanding of a narrow area of their field.
Yeah, I would add to that. I think the specialization in the mathematical sciences, so pure math and physics, for example, it's a very special, kind of specialization, because you often hear advisors talk about particular problems or conjectures that students ought to focus their energies on. And so I think that might contrast a little bit with other genres of specialization and other AOKs. There's a sense in which that's hyper-specialized, which makes this even more fascinating, because you could be hyper-general in those very same fields, math and physics in particular. So I think those AOKs especially are going to be very interesting here, because you can find yourself hyper-specializing, but also at this like never-ending temptation to think very generally.
But if,
Yeah.
if you're saying, if you are hyper generalized, would you understand all that your colleagues are doing in their specialized fields? Probably not. I mean, you'd have a good overview of various areas of physics or mathematics, but would you understand what everyone in every department is doing?
Yeah. No, the historical aspect, yeah, full sympathies with that, but I think the specialization, there's something unique going on there in math, where you focus on a particular problem. It's not just you specialize in a certain area of mathematics, like number theory or harmonic analysis or whatever it is. There's like, your advisor gives you a problem that remains unproved, and you're meant to put all of your energy and efforts into that. Whereas other AOKs, we might see different kinds of specialization, where it's more of an area or an approach or an avenue. So there seems to be, what I find fascinating personally, is there seems to be evidence of extreme specialization, again, both in math and physics, for example, but at the same time, these are fields that strike us as being very conducive to unbelievable generalization. So you really see the tension there. And just since we're at the beginning, I would want to lay down another key distinction that we should probably have on the table before we go further, and that between kind of the cultural economy, like we're talking about now, these cultural forces that might cause a researcher to become more specialized or more generalist in the research, versus our own mental economy, where we feel these same forces within us, but it's not necessarily dictated by society or the culture we find ourselves in. These are temptations within us to either focus on that very kind of narrow avenue or a particular problem, or to think more widely and broadly about the context we're working in. So I think we're naturally going to fluctuate between those, but we should be aware of that difference, I imagine, between real economy and our own mental economies.
I think it's worth just interjecting here an example of the type of specialization you would see outside of math. So this is just a dissertation I grabbed from the UMass Amherst English department. The title may be confusing because it's technical language, but it shows how even within such a specific space, there's actually a lot of content to cover. So the title is a 19th century ethnographic exhibit on Cage, narratives of informal empire, Afro-Latinidad, and contemporary artistic reframings. So basically what you're looking at here is the sort of legacy of empire, the Afro-Latino experience, and how artists are grappling with that. Now that seems really narrow, but in reality, there are many artists working in that space. I mean, you can imagine hundreds, honestly, that you could look at through this lens. That seems to me a sort of qualitatively different experience than I have this problem I'm working through. So I think that's a useful distinction to bring up as well. I think we want to kind of keep on moving forward a little bit here into the idea of production. How does specialization work when it comes to production within the AOKs? Do we have any examples? Can we think of any sort of ways in which specialization is necessary in AOKs other than mathematics? For the production, again, of knowledge, let's focus on creating new knowledge.
I would think in art, in order to create new ways of artistic expression, you would have to specialize in some new techniques to produce the art. I mean, okay, it's like if you look back throughout history, like there's been painting, there's been sculpture, well, then someone had to look at, well, new ways of painting and creating different types of paints to use, and they would specialize in this. They would specialize in different techniques for drawing the human body. They would specialize in different ways of carving, or even different ways of producing art, moving from wood to stone to metal. And that would produce new knowledge. I mean, if your culture is only working with wood, and then suddenly you come up, it's like, oh, well, why don't I do something with metal? And then you start building artistic works just using metal. You're specializing in that. You are building knowledge on how to create art.
Referring to the production of knowledge, I believe that the production of knowledge currently would be a little bit more focused on specialization, because most of the general knowledge about different AOKs has already been discovered. We have a lot of examples of general knowledge being discovered in old times, like for example, in terms of math, the basics of math. Most of the the ideas of math had already been discovered a long time ago, but there is more people trying to specialize in specific branches of math. Like for example, another example that we can take is the natural sciences. Basic knowledge about natural sciences is kind of already discovered, the general ideas, but for example, there are people like geneticists that focus on genetics and how they work, or astrophysicists that focus on a specific type of astronomy. I think that the time factor is also important in that.
We can continue moving on here. I think this idea of generalized knowledge being a historical process, I think is quite interesting, right? How do we think about that with history? Are there sort of general knowledge of history that we just get because of time, right? And basically what you're getting at is, okay, if we're going into physics, the initial discoveries in physics are quite general, easy to grasp, don't require a lot of specialized knowledge. Will we say that's the same for history?
What you're making me think of is the kind of risk associated we might want to imagine when we make these decisions between specializing or generalizing too, because Mr. Hendricks contrasting history and natural sciences, and there's something about, often in science we use this phrase scientific revolutions, which was a bit dramatic when it was first used, but it remains relatively true that there are these kind of revolutionary periods in science where we have to abandon and move on from a bunch of previous assumptions, whereas history, something like history, things tend to get sedimented almost literally sometimes in archaeology, and there's much more risk if someone's going to overthrow the interpretation of a whole culture during a certain period. There's a lot of risk to that, because that's going to interface with the periods that come before and after and the regions that neighbor it. And so if someone has a novel interpretation or a novel contribution to history, there's going to be some, pushback within themselves and from their colleagues, because it's going to have all these other ramifications. Whereas in physics, sometimes it's stigmatized, sometimes it's looked down upon, and yet people can and should take risky chances that might have to throw out a lot of previous physics. But in the end, on the other side of the revolution, it might end up being worth it. So we get a lot of these kind of wholesale reconfigurations in something like physics
I
compared
think
to
in
history.
either physics or history, you do find there's a lot of pressure on people not to take those radical steps.
Yeah.
That you should conform to like the present dogma almost.
Yeah. Yeah.
When you talk about history, I can't help but think about some of these people that you'll see on the internet who talk about, the history of the Americas. Well, when was America settled? And I guess the dogma is, people first came here 13,000, 14,000 years ago to the Americas. And then there are others who say, no, that's total garbage. Like, people have been here for thousands of years, tens of thousands of years longer than that. And they're trying to like overthrow this basically old regime that, people started coming here 13,000 years ago.
Yeah.
I think that's actually a good space for this notion of, I think it's important to animate this, make it a real thing that we have to defend and think about. It's easy, I think, for us to understand the demands of specialization in production of knowledge, as we've all kind of just been talking about. We need specialists to do new math, new specialists to do new art. But it is also saying that there are demands for generalization in the production of knowledge. It's basically saying that generalization is required for new knowledge. It seems like you were almost kind of getting at this point. We can imagine these historians, right? I'd say I focus on the Pueblo peoples, and I'm really heavily focused on their use of tools, and I've done a lot of archaeological work there. Am I, as an individual, going to be able to tell the story that you're telling? What is my contribution to that? Is it interfacing with generalists? Is it getting a bunch of specialists in a room and combining your knowledge? So the kind of role of the generalist as the producer of new knowledge, what does that look like within the AOKs? Especially, I think, within mathematics, because we focus so heavily on the role of specialists for producing new knowledge.
I mean, my idea is that a generalist is more of a link between specialists. Because two specialists, one can be off in this area, one can be off in this area, and they're kind of pigeonholed, they're in their own little hole over here, their own little closet, and there may be a link with someone else who's doing something quite different, but they just don't see it. Whereas a third person who may generalize more would be able to see that link, and in that way help produce greater knowledge just by looking at the link between different specialties and saying, oh, well, how does this pertain to something completely different in a way that most people wouldn't even recognize it. I like to think of the famous commencement speech that Steve Jobs gave when he talks about creating the computer, the Apple, the original Apple computer that he did, and like how studying art just encouraged him in doing the calligraphy. Oh, these are the different fonts that I'm going to use on an Apple computer. I'm going to put all of these in it, and he did this just because he studied art and calligraphy. And now it's like, it's common. It's like on all our computers we have these various fonts. You can choose from hundreds of fonts and put them in. And that's like Steve Jobs saying, well, I took a class once and studied calligraphy, and that's why this is there, because I think I was able to link that area of knowledge of art with the creation of the computer. But yeah, I think like in terms of reconciling, you need someone who can look over here, look over here, look over here, and find ways to different fields of knowledge.
Yeah, it's interesting, people, there's a famous quote by the philosopher Carnap, who talks about bridge building and this same kind of thing, and his quote is pretty negative, because he speaks from this perspective that if you want to be a bridge builder, if you want to bring specialists together, like Mr. Ravone is saying, well, again, that comes with a big risk, because you kind of have to have the standards of that first culture and the standards of the second culture for both cultures to respect you and listen to you. And, you know, if you don't meet those kind of acceptance criteria, then you're taking this huge risk in trying to build bridges. But again, I think part of what we've already been saying is it's often a risk worth taking, and it is interesting to think about how we get these pressures, these economic pressures. There's the real, like Mr. Henniker is saying, like often specialization does result in, well, let's say the most concrete form of knowledge, technology, and relatedly innovation and progressing our economies in that manner. So we do feel that need, but the generalization really has this kind of longer term, I think, you know, maybe the best metaphor in the back of our mind is generalization, when done well, can really accelerate our culture and innovation technology. But it's more of a, you know, we're talking century-long scale, whereas if we want these short-term, you know, improvements, then specialization often kind of wins the day, at least on that economic level. Yeah. I mean, if now's the time, I was going to mention, interestingly, in math, since that's the AOK we're meant to be focused on, one of the most celebrated figures of the past century was this Frenchman, Grothendieck, who kind of quite famously maybe ran away and became a bit crazy in his later life. But in his same years, he was known and remembered as this generalist and a very childish, a self-described childish thinker. He thought in these very general terms, he produced very general math, and he did this in the face of a professional community that was highly specialized. You know, every colleague he had was, you know, specialized in a certain field of mathematics. And yet here this one guy was kind of building bridges, showing connections between the fields. And now, half a century later, we kind of remember him as, you know, the most important figure. And we want to be careful because we don't want to fall into like celebrity culture pitfalls. But I think it's undeniably true that this guy has contributed to the progress of math as an AOK, probably more so than any other figure in the past 100 years. But if you look at his work, again, it was all of a very general and often abstract nature. Often people can even categorize like what field he was working in, since it was between everything. And I found in trying to kind of whittle down his method, his recipe, there's a nice kind of phrase that people tend to say to describe his work now. And the first step of a lot of his work was finding the right, what he called the right world for a problem. And we get this big distinction. So I think the other distinction we have on the table in terms of people and knowers and researchers is theory builders, bridge builders, versus problem solvers. So people who are focused on particular problems, maybe their supervisor gives it to them and says, hey, this is your ticket to having a career, solve this, and you make a name for yourself, versus bridge builders and theory builders. And Grothendieck, as a theory builder, his first step in his process was always finding the right world for a problem. That's what he was obsessed with. He wasn't obsessed about the problem or how others have kind of tried to attack it. It was about putting it in the right kind of ambient environment, in the right context. And this whole pretty like bold vision was, hey, if we plug a problem into the right framework and picture and context, then all of a sudden it's a lot easier to solve. And that sounds kind of magical, but turns out after proved to be effective. That's literally what he did over and over again. He found the worlds for problems that people have racked their brains, hit their head against a wall for so long, trying the same methods, becoming more and more specialized, but he zoomed out and he had this completely different approach, and he said, hey, let's try to search around for worlds. Let's create different types of pictures and worlds, and then we plug these same problems back in, and they end up looking differently. So yeah, I just want to highlight, I think we are dealing with two, not only forces within our economies, but often two very different styles of thinking. These types of people, and it's a bit premature for me to say this, I told Mr. Henrik earlier, often in our TOK essays, we tell you guys, okay, wait until the end of your essay to criticize the PT itself. So I'm violating my own rule right now. I am tempted to criticize the PT immediately, because how can we reconcile? My short answer would be we can't. We can't. These are fundamentally incompatible styles of thinking and reasoning and approaching problems. And so I don't think we necessarily need to reconcile them, but finding a place where they are both kind of optimized and pursued and to use the economic language again, to pursued in productive ways. Yeah, that's an important question related to that. So yeah, I don't know if anyone else feels as strongly about that as I do. Like, do we really need to reconcile these in the manner that Mr. Henrik defined? Like, bring into friendly relation, or in a logical manner, make them consistent with each other? Or can they kind of be, we have this division of labor. Some people think kind of in a generalist way, and some people think in a specialist way. And as long as they communicate, like Mr. Ravone was saying, if the generalist has that compulsion to knock on specialist doors and say, hey, BT dubs, I think you guys might be onto similar things. Yeah, is that something you guys sympathize with? Or am I too extreme here?
I think actually yes, and I agree with you on the point that reconciling specialization and generalization would not be really easy, and it's better to have them both on their own path and meeting at some points where a generalist can meet between two specialists and go to a point beyond that specialization. But I think that in terms of production of knowledge, if someone wants to produce more general knowledge, then they get into the generalization part and they talk to other generalists and everything. But once you become a specialist in something, that's where you dig further in the hole to find if there's more information about something that you're searching, and that's where you can produce even more knowledge than the one that already exists. But to produce more knowledge, I think being specialized is just more effective, and being generalized just helps link the knowledges that have been produced, link them together and find another type of specialization that you can think of. But I think that reconciling them is not really the easy way, and I agree with you that I don't think it can be done, but to find more knowledge and learn about more things, you have to be specialized in something. But then to generalize between different knowledges, then there is where you ask to a generalist, as he has at least a basic knowledge of every area that you're looking at.
I might be able to motivate a counter.
Yeah.
One of your favorite thinkers, Mr. J. Simone
They.
Thank you. I actually misread this quote when I added it. Now with this conversation, I think has actually really illuminated the depth of this quote. The quote is, "The whole of our civilization is founded on specialization, which implies the enslavement of those who execute to those who coordinate." Now my original understanding of this quote was something along the lines of, those who specialize have some sort of intellectual power and can force those underneath them to do work. But I actually am now rereading this as the specialist is enslaved to the coordinator, which in our situation is the generalist. The generalist points, specialists dig there, do work there. And if we agree with this sort of relationship, then reconciliation is very much an important idea because it's between one of power and one of less power. I don't know if we agree with this description of the relationship between the specialist and the generalist.
I don't know if it's power or less power. It's almost like a project manager.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to build a new ship, one person can't do this, right? There's no way that one person can build all the components of a spaceship. You have to have someone who's in control, saying, okay, you're going to do this, you're going to do this, you're going to do this, and you have someone organizing, as this says, the enslavement of those who execute to those who coordinate. You have to have someone who coordinates to get the job done, so that you know that all parts of the ship are created. Now, you may be really good at building one part of the ship, you may be really good at doing something else, you may be really good at doing something else. Now, someone's got to take that and put it all together. But there's no way that you can expect one person or one group to be able to do everything. It's just not going to happen. Like if I look at that quote that you have above this, which says, a human being should be able to change a diaper, plan an invasion, butcher a hog, con a ship, design a building, write a sonnet, balance accounts, build a wall, so on and so forth. Well, okay, I can do some of those things, you know. I can even build a wall, but can I build the Great Wall? No. Right? It takes a certain degree of specialization to do that. Right? I can design a building.
Yeah.
Can I design the Empire State Building? No.
This is interesting, what Mr. Ravine's giving us right now is interesting to think about in terms of pure math though, because I like this example from engineering. Like, turns out, I mean, not only rockets and spaceships, but just our planes that we fly in all the time. It turns out, I was really surprised when I first learned this, like, some parts are just manufactured in Germany, other parts are manufactured in China, others are made in America, and this is like standard practice, and they're all made in separate factories, they're completely independent, not communicating with each other at all, and then they're pieced together, and eventually, you know, forms the aircraft that we happily become passengers on. Whereas like in math, something very abstract, like a proof in mathematics, it's interesting to kind of force that production onto the same process. And I think 99% of the time, it just won't work, being that clean. And it's interesting to think about why it doesn't work. But often, like the most celebrated proofs in math, there's like, everything you guys studied, there's like a little bit of algebra. It's one part of the proof that's like all algebra. And then there's another part of the proof that's like serious high-level geometry. And then there's another part of the proof, like what Miss Wendy's doing, like matrices. There's all these different parts. But it would never work if, you know, specialists from those different areas just kind of glued together those parts of the proof to make this one big proof. And, you know, it would be like, even if it did work, it could be like the ugliest proof of all time, you know? So, yeah, what's the difference there? Is it just one's concrete and one's abstract? Like, why in some AOKs, I mean, engineering is not an AOK, but we can think of it as such. Why in some AOKs we can have such a clean division of labor? Like, I don't think, as surprised as I was when I first learned that about aircraft design, I mean, I was super surprised. I had no idea these different parts completely manufactured in different countries. And yeah, I still fly. I still feel like as safe as I used to. I'm not too worried about the plane crashing. But if I learned that something like a proof in math was just this kind of glued together mess from different specialists, even if I was not an expert, I think I would maybe even notice it aesthetically to begin with. Like, I don't understand this proof, I don't follow it, I don't know enough about mathematics, but something weird going on here that doesn't look like, you know, how math should look. So what's the difference there, I wonder?
I wanted to add to the quote the Simon Weil quote, because it says, "And the enslavement of those who execute to those who coordinate." Personally, I don't see it as necessarily as an enslavement, because people that specialize in a specific branch of knowledge can try to specialize and find and dig deeper into that knowledge without having a generalist behind saying them do that. I feel like there's not an enslavement relationship in that way, or not necessarily. It can be, there can obviously be, but sometimes it doesn't depend on a generalist telling them, well, focus on this part and you focus on that part, and then I'm gonna unite them.
And I think that the generalist can tell the specialist to execute a focusing on one topic to an extent, and then it's where there is one barrier that after that barrier is just specialists in between them that might just connect things in between them. Saying, for example, in medicine and anatomy, the generalist knows up to some point the body anatomy, the medicine, things like that, but the specialists know much further than that. And even though the generalist can tell them to dig further into the why cramps happen, for example, or things like that, after some point, the specialist has the answers, and then the generalist might say, okay, now you have the answers, but I don't know if there is further than these answers or not. Whereas two specialists are like, these two answers are similar, and we can see that there is actually something after this that we have not found, so we are going to connect together and search further than that for different muscles, where the generalist didn't think that there would be something further than that. So the generalist can help on the research of the project to a certain point, and after that point, I think that it all relies on the specialists and on them, on their understanding and how deep they actually went in the research to find if there is more or less to find. And that is where a generalist stops having this sort of word on the specialists and on their researches.
But also, for example, we have examples in history, well, not in the AOK history, but like, for example, in natural sciences, we have examples of researchers being both generalists and specialists. I believe that they can, these two sides of the coin can work together, but maybe it's what Mr. Johnson said, that we cannot reconcile them. Like, for example, we have the example of Isaac Newton. Isaac Newton discovered gravity, and he first applied gravity to the Earth, but then he discovered the theory of universal gravity and extrapolated it to the whole universe. He started specializing in the gravity inside of Earth, but then he generalized it, and he found a way to apply it to a more general idea of the entire universe.
Yeah,
I have a wrench to throw in there.
please.
My job as moderator, right?
Please
Um,
don't wrench.
We tried to motivate this a little bit more. I take everything that you all are saying. I think that there's a more insidious thing happening here that she's getting at. And it might be something along the lines of this. Talking of anatomy, right? We used to have a theory about humors, right? This notion of there being bile, this weird imbalance between things, so we have to do bloodletting and all these processes.
Well, that's not true anymore.
You gotta watch out for us. And what I would argue is that was not the invention of specialists, right? That's the invention of a generalist. A generalist who looks at the human body, looks at the available knowledge, and describes, creates a narrative, creates a framework by which specialists then work. So you had specialists digging in, trying to figure out why bloodletting works in this situation versus this situation. Why, we need to deal with bile in this way versus this way. And in that way, the enslavement is not necessarily a one-to-one of I'm commanding, but it's almost like an intellectual enslavement. The generalist sets the terms of the investigation, and then the specialist digs in. And it is only when another generalist comes and knocks out the previous story or narrative, which would apply to, I guess, the idea of scientific revolutions, for example, that then the specialists will go, okay, here's my new marching orders. Here's the new framework within which I'm working. And to your point, yeah, of course, Isaac Newton, in the early days of sciences, there was much, in mathematics as well, there was much more space for someone to be both of these things. But as society, as the intellectual pursuits become more varied and complex, would it not be that we had this increasing division of labor, similar almost to that of which economics comes back to again, right? There's almost sort of like a Marxist aspect of this notion of, in modern society, at one point man was both in control of the production, the means of production, and the product, right? And now the means of production are controlled by the generalist, and the specialist is just the laborer within the factory of knowledge. That is an extended metaphor, do with it what you will.
I'm happy we're still discussing this quote, because I think we might be taking the analogy too far here. I think that power structure of executor and coordinator goes hand in hand with specialization as such, and I wouldn't want to put coordinator in the role of the generalist. Because for me, in my mind, the generalist is that's a standpoint of love. Mr. Vaughan's example, so it's like knocking on multiple doors, bringing people together. So the generalist, unlike someone who's barking commands or kind of telling people tactically what to do or where to stand and what to work on, I believe Simone is probably trying to get closer to like that power structure of coordinator and executor, like that power structure in itself goes hand in hand with a culture that's fixated on specialization. Whereas actually being a generalist, we need to be careful because it sounds like general in an army. Not a general in an army, it's a lover. I feel like a generalist is someone who kind of just, it's just like this communal spirit of synthetically bringing things together. So I wouldn't want to kind of read it in that way. I think that difference, coordinator plus executor, is part of the specialization package, and generalization is something else entirely. I don't know, yeah. So you're shaking your head there. Do you agree with that, you think?
I don't understand very clearly, so.
Oh, okay, right. I was just thinking, because in her quote, she says, our civilization is founded on specialization. It implies the enslavement of those who execute to those who coordinate. And I think in the beginning, we were thinking like the executors were the specialists and the coordinators were maybe generalists, kind of giving commands or telling people where to go. But I don't think I would want to read it that way. I think generalists, whatever they are I think more in line with what Mr. Bravone was describing, these types of people or types of thinking that are synthetic, bring things together, not necessarily commanding, but unifying and synthesizing.
Finding links.
Finding links, yeah.
And it doesn't necessarily have to be just a mathematician within mathematics.
Mm-hmm.
It links between, like Steve Jobs, art and computers, links between literature and science, links between disparate fields where you would never expect to see any connections.
Yeah.
And you make these connections, and that is what helps produce knowledge.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, you can think about, what scientific methods could be used in new forms of art. There may be something that, this scientist discovered something new. Well, you know what? I could use that to produce a cool new sculpture, right? And you think about, 3D printers, right?
No.
What can you do with a 3D printer? There's a link between different fields. Like 3D printers can be used to produce airplane parts. Well, they can be used to produce cool works of art, hang in your wall also. It's like material science. Okay, well, I can use different materials for this or for that. So there's links that go beyond just within the field, links between any field of knowledge that you can think of.
Now there's, forget the name of it, but there's like a folk theorem, not a real theorem, but a folk theorem of Wikipedia, named after someone that says the field that you, don't like the H word, so I don't want to use it. The field that you despise the most is the field that you'll need the most for the next phase of your research. And, you know, it's just kind of a saying people say in research, but it's probably more oftentimes true than not, that kind of this looking for connections tends to be, as far as progress, back to this like economic need for production too. But even in a Marxist sense, like a larger sense of progress, often progress itself seems to be of more of a generalist inclination than a specialist inclination.
Which is a perfect transition.
Okay.
We're going to turn to the crowd in a minute. I think that you actually got onto the exact thing. And I'm sorry I keep coming back to this, but I think especially seeing as the day, wearing the sunglasses, thinking about people who are marginalized, people who have suffered in these sort of power relations, I think it's still important for us to think about the generalist and who gets to be a generalist, right? What type of persons do we see? I mean, we can talk about in abstraction, we can also talk in reality. When we think about those in the sciences, people who are communicators of science who seem to be able to breach between these different places, it is often more common than not that you see people of a certain type, certain placement, right? People who are allowed versus people who are told specialize. The economic sort of part of specialization, right, is it's very easy for you to show a product, to validate one's work. The space to generalize, it seems, requires some largesse of your employer, be it the corporation, be it the company, be it the academic institution you work at, right? And so I think that that might help motivate this conflict a little bit more. It's not to say the generalists may not love what they do. I mean, I'm going to use Neil deGrasse Tyson as an example. This man clearly overwhelmingly loves what he does. He loves bridging between these different disciplines, talking widely, connecting knowledge and communicating it for an audience. But there is something to be said about the power position he holds in determining sort of the direction of the conversation. What sort of places make it more social sort of interest, which will lead then to specialists moving in a certain place versus not a certain place. We can even see this obviously within English departments. If I wanted to specialize in a particular type of, we can imagine, in William Wordsworth, I think most English departments would start to turn me away from this. Not just because it's not worth investigating, but because the notion of generalists saying, hey, there's a whole nother field, a whole nother space within which not enough work's being done. And if you want to do this work, you can, but really we need to do more work in these areas versus these areas. So the notion of coordinator, I think, is still, I think, relevant and important. Maybe I'm over pushing this. What do we all think on this idea?
I'm maybe a little confused about this idea of coordinator. If there's a task at hand that something that needs to be accomplished, you need a coordinator. Or the coordinator may not even be looking at the task at hand, but just maybe looking at two completely different ideas and how do they relate. You're looking at this more like really in a structure of, okay, you're doing this, you should do this, you should do this. I guess at universities that may apply when you're deciding on what field of research you're going to go into. You may get a lot of pressure to go one way or to go another. I don't see that as a coordinator though.
It is only because Mr. Henry brought up Neil deGrasse Tyson, who I don't, as passionate as he is, I don't always love, because he has said some very simple-minded things about the field of philosophy in particular, and not only has he said that, late in his life, since he's developed a reputation having specialized so much, he's gone through those phases that society dictates, okay, you need to specialize first in order to make a name for yourself, to have a career, et cetera, et cetera. So he established that reputation, and then that gives him this privilege, ultimately. He's got this, like Mr. Henrik, the language Mr. Henrik is giving us, it's very much a right or privilege. Once you go through the specialization phase, then you can be a generalist. But that's almost as worse as the first specialization rite of passage that I already have problems with, because then, once these people have this right and privilege to be a generalist, well, they're not worried about their reputation because they already have that, that's in the bag. And so they get away, like Neil deGrasse Tyson publishes books on philosophy, philosophical topics, and he knows very little about philosophy. He's never actually studied it. Sorry, Neil, if you're listening. You haven't really studied it. But he's an established cosmologist and physicist, and so that's kind of enough for him to become a generalist. And most of society kind of allows it to happen. So I think this kind of clear order of operations, where we go through specialization as a rite of passage, and then if we survive and we get the stamp of approval, then we're allowed to be a generalist. That last phase is almost even worse than the first one, because then you get these people making these broad-ranging statements that are not so accurate, not so useful. So yeah, I think it kind of speaks to what you were saying, Mr. Henry. Like there's something, that power structure, and notice again, like back to our AOK focus in math, I do just want to kind of emphasize that that's a clear order of operations in our real economies, and I personally find that very different than our mental economies. Especially in mathematics, we are constantly pulled in both directions. It's literally in the equations we write down. You know, like when you substitute in a number, you're specializing. And when you change from 2 dimensions to think about 3 dimensions, you're generalizing. Like Javier's physics examples with Newton, you know, like, you know, the notation itself really just causes us to want to generalize things. And then when we really want to solve a problem, we substitute and specialize. And so like the whole nature of the discipline is kind of navigating these two forces. And yet society seems to dictate, like, no, if you wanna, that's great you have passion, but it's not enough. You gotta really specialize first, and you gotta do exactly what your supervisor says, because he or she knows what will get you into a certain position. And then once you do that for 20, 30, 40 years, then you can be like Neil and publish some general philosophy books that don't really have an impact on actual philosophy. Okay, I did my diatribe, I'm sorry.
Any last thoughts before we go into the audience? Sung, even though it's been a lot of conversation.
I just want to talk just a little bit quickly about the production of knowledge of specialists. I had this example while Mr. Johnson was talking about philosophy and Neil deGrasse Tyson. I remember reading a book about Schopenhauer, and well, he helped produce knowledge as he specialized in philosophy and in a lot of topics. He has a book about dialectic, where he studied Greek philosophers and historical philosophers such as Aristotle or Socrates, and he studied how the dialectic was used. And another example that he also, I don't know if he talks about it, but it's also related to his book, is Confucius. He really made a book that really digs deeper into how dialectic can be used in debates, and that really helps, for example, now politicians of nowadays, or when you go to court and everything, it helps really like your, how do you call it, your lawyers. Using dialectic helps really win a case, for example, even though the proofs are against you. And he really produced this book that is just a boom of knowledge into people about how speaking can change the outcome of a debate just by knowing how to speak and knowing how to use different strategies. And he divides it into nearly 40 strategies. Yeah. So he specialized into that and decided to dig deeper into that for years until finding everything and all the structure, and then advancing it to a point where he made a book and produced a whole lot of knowledge, new knowledge that wasn't there before.
And for a general audience, right?
Yeah, for a
Taking-
general audience that didn't have that deep, the as deep knowledge as he had. Yeah.
And I think, I mean, to rephrase this, and I know we have to move on, but the idea of generalist as translator, I think is a really useful metaphor,
Mhm.
right? To have learned this language and done all this work, and then be able to express that in another language or to a population that doesn't speak that language. Of course, you lose nuance, but there's obviously value in making it accessible for people. Want to make sure we have a chance to speak, if we have any thoughts, and then we'll ask some questions of the audience. So anything you want us to add or contribute?
I just want to focus on like those like terms specialization and generalization. I think this is I think those terms already like responsive like interact each other, because like if I want to be expert like specialist of something, I think I need to understand some like generalized information first. It means that like if I want to master of like in math like a special function, I need to know what is like I need to know about what is not related with function. So it means that like specialization contains already like generalization. So it means that you don't have to like reconcile them. It already both are interacts each other. So you just need to find like which concept we have to like plug in.
I love this idea.
That reminds me of the thing of worlds, the problems you talked about. How this problem of reconciling it, if we put it in the correct world, they are already reconciled.
Yeah. I like this idea to end with, going to the audience, this notion that every specialist at some point was and continues to be a generalist to some extent. Wonderful. Audience, the hundreds of you, hello, it's such a
Yeah,
pleasure.
we
that
can't
you're
take
all here.
everyone's questions.
I know we're kind of
So-
pressed for time, so if
Yeah.
you have any last questions, one or two would be fantastic.
I'm kind of interested in how both specialization and generalization might be impacted by environment, and I think some of you have kind of touched on some things that overlap this idea a little bit, but someone might be considered a generalist in one environment, but with that same knowledge be a specialist in another environment. I think it kind of, it goes along with what you were saying, sorry, I don't know. And
Some, yeah.
yeah, with what some was saying, and then, I heard some other ideas that connect with that as well.
Yeah.
And it wasn't really a question, but.
I mean, I think that ties in, I don't know, the moderator, I think that ties in exactly with the connection that the three of you just made.
Yes. I'm thinking of an example that I could give, but a generalist, for example, in medicine, in physical therapists, for example, there is a generalist, but then the generalist, for example, there might be specialists for the ankles, right, or for the knees, like surgeons that are specialists into knee surgery, ankle surgery, elbow surgery. But then, if you put a generalist about physical therapy and a specialist into, for example, the knee, which can get injured really a lot of times, if you put them together into a knee surgery, well, the generalist, with all his knowledge about the tendons, the dislocation of the knee and everything, might become just a specialist into it, and might be able to just know, because of his knowledge of how to tape a knee for preventing injuries, or his knowledge about the injuries of the knee, might be able to just do the surgeon's job as well and be a specialist of the knee in that situation. Same as a specialist about
muscles like the biceps might also know the quadriceps really well, as they are similar muscles. One is bigger, but they are pretty similar. So I think that if you move a specialist into another area of knowledge where, like into another area of the body where he is also a specialist, that makes him more of a generalist. And if you move a generalist into somewhere where he is experienced, that makes him a specialist. So I think that really, yes, moving a generalist or specialist in the world where they adapt better, that just makes them the opposite, the specialist or a generalist. Yeah.
The term really depends on your perspective. Like you teach math, well, okay, for some people that would make you a specialist, but you may just teach general math, many different subjects in math.
Yeah,
So in one sense you're a specialist, in one sense you're a generalist.
right,
So
yeah.
what you call someone who specializes and someone who generalizes depends on how you were looking at this.
Yeah. And another distinction that we never brought up, strangely, is like method versus content too. I mean, so often we divide not only mathematics, but a lot of our AOKs in terms of content. But methodologies are also ways of dividing up what we work on. And you made me think of, so there's a type of researcher called a mathematical physicist, a real name. Some people actually have this title, but they don't live in physics departments, they live in mathematics departments. And it's just for these purely kind of like social categorizing problems, because they don't, let's see if I can get this. From a physics perspective, they're like generalists because they think about everything and anything in physics. So physicists are like, oh, you're not a real researcher because you're just thinking about everything, and that's chaotic, confusing, and unproductive economically, so please leave our department. So that's the physics perspective. And then they go to a math department, and the mathematicians are like, oh, you only care about exactly solvable physics problems. So they're a specialist. So from the physics perspective, they're these crazy generalists that just want to think about everything. And from the math perspective, they're like hyper specialists. They're like, because other mathematicians are dealing with problems that you can't solve all the time. They're like, no, we have to solve the problems. Yeah. So yeah, to Miss Wendy's cool question, like, yeah, there's some big perspective things going on here, and I think method versus content is another distinction that maybe we should have addressed. Yeah.
And I think to respect everyone's time, we're gonna bring it into the end here. I think what we just animated here, though, at the end, is I think the wisdom, I don't often say this, of this PT in using the term reconcile. Right? We started focusing on, starting with this quote, the notion of relationships, that there is some relationship, and I think it was really animated by the notion that what is considered general versus specialized is relational. There is no generalist in a vacuum, right? That it is always in relationship to someone else with knowledge, which really, I think, makes this word reconcile powerful. There's two meanings. There's one, again, to make one account consistent with another. The first meaning is to restore friendly relations between. And if we take this quote, there being some sort of antagonism potentially between the two, if we understand it as a relationship, the quote really is about, the question is about how can we make these two friendly, these two different groups. So I appreciate everyone coming today. I wish we had more time for questions if you want to ask our panel. Round of applause for everyone, and we'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you, guys.
Excellent. Very, very good.
And teachers.
You were like sitting there the whole time.
Oh, sorry. And you
Does this still work? This worked. Okay. And